Hello, everyone, and welcome to Literary Tales. I'm your host, Paul Krause, and in this episode, as we continue our classical conversation with Thucydides, we turn to one of the most famous episodes contained in the history of the Peloponnesian War, the corruption of language and the Corsairian Civil War. In a celebrated analysis of the corruption of language and its relationship with deteriorated character, Thucydides reflects on the symbiotic relationship of language with moral character. Language is meant to be clear, meaningful, and understandable. The clarity of language ebbs and flows with the moral character of the speaker and the population at large. A morally upright person speaks clearly and doesn't hide their intentions. A morally corrupt person speaks in tongues, is vague and misleading so as to hide their interior intentions. Words and language, according to Thucydides, do not change meaning over time per se, as much as they change with the ebb and flow of personal character. Words and language change to confusion when employed by immoral people, revolutionaries and radicals, who use the confusion of language to sow chaos in society to sweep themselves to power. Concerning the civil war in Corsaira, which ripped the Corsairian civil society apart, Thucydides notes, "So revolutions broke out in city after city, and in places where the revolutions occurred late, the knowledge of what happened previously in other places caused still new extravagances of revolutionary zeal, expressed by an elaboration on the methods of seizing power, by unheard of atrocities in revenge. To fit in with the change of events, words too had to change their usual meanings. What used to be described as a thoughtless act of aggression was now regarded as the courage one would expect to find in a party member. To think of the future and wait was merely another way of saying one was a coward. Any idea of moderation was just an attempt to disguise one's unmanly character. Ability to understand a question from all sides meant that one was totally unfitted for action. Fanatical enthusiasm was the mark of a real man, and to plot against an enemy behind his back was perfectly legitimate self-defense. Anyone who held violent opinions could always be trusted, and anyone who objected to them became a suspect. To plot successfully was a sign of intelligence, but it was still cleverer to see that a plot was hatching. The prescient nature of Thucydides is almost mind-numbing considering how long ago he wrote, especially to those of us who live in the modern day, who often see many of the same things occurring in our society that Thucydides described during the history of the Peloponnesian War. Especially in politics today, how often do we see zeal and revolutionary action as the true hallmark of party politics and the party man? And how often do we scoff at those who preach moderation, virtue, and respect for all sides? Thucydides' reflection is arguably the first capturing of what Friedrich Nietzsche called the transvaluation of values. Reservation, moderation, and compromise, once considered the worthy virtues that man should possess, were now held in absolute contempt. What mattered was zeal, which is a lack of restraint. Aristotle would call that excess. But this excess was now what was precisely extolled in the confused landscape of Corsaira in her civil war as virtuous. As Thucydides writes, fanatical enthusiasm was the mark of a real man, and to plot against an enemy behind his back was perfectly legitimate self-defense. One could say that the destruction of the social fabric, the social and political edifice of Corsaira, reverted man to his primal nature, like man in the Hobbesian state of nature. Those chains that constrain man's libido, that Jean-Jacques Rousseau deplores as having enslaved man at the beginning of his social contract, are the chains necessary for ethical community and ethical life, social life, to emerge and flourish. Moreover, men cannot know each other because of their conniving and backstabbing intentions. Hell, men can't even understand one another because when one man says moderation is virtue, in the back of his mind he has to be thinking that he's lying and that he's ready to stab him in the back for the zeal of revolution and radicalism. Moreover, men cannot know each other precisely because of their conniving and backstabbing intentions. All are kept at a distance from one another, and no relationships can be formed. One is always questioning whether or not they are about to be pursued, arrested, or destroyed by someone they considered their friend. Even among the fanatical elite, there can never be true trust among each other, as the other may in fact be plotting against him in the long term. We must remember that plotting is virtuous, but a greater sign of intelligence was being able to recognize that a plot was hatching. What Thucydides also recognizes is how clarity, relationship, and functionality in language and society begins to break away through the corruption of language. Trust, that social fabric of life in Corsairian, had fallen apart, and civil war and civil strife resulted as a result of it. Language, that phenomenon which humans possess to know truth and build relationships, is of course tied to the moral character of individuals and the moral character of society itself. A society that is virtuous and built on trust has a clarity of language that perpetuates virtue and trust through the generations. You can trust somebody's word, therefore you can trust him to keep his word, and that is what builds civil society. A society that is corrupt embraces fanaticism to the point of man becoming beast, and one where trust is absent sees its language corrupted to fit in with the changes of the time occurring all around it. In another way of putting it, can you trust someone's word? Because someone's word, someone's speech, is the outward extension of their inner character, whenever someone is speaking, we have to ask ourselves that question. Do I trust him? Is he honorable? Can we accept his word at face value? An honorable man is honorable not simply because of his character, but because his words can be counted on. His speech reflects his character. A dishonorable man is dishonorable because his character is reflected in his word, his speech. A dishonorable man's language cannot be trusted, and in not being able to be trusted, we can never truly build a relationship with such a person. Unable to build relationships with such people in society leads to the destruction of society. In a society that falls into this confusion of language and morality, it is not that society cannot come about, but that the existing society in of itself entirely collapses. The animalistic power struggle of man's libido is released as a result of this moral confusion and corruption of language. In this lawless environment, Thucydides remarks how nobility was no longer a virtue, but something altogether untrue and a sham. There was no such thing as nobility at all. All that there was naked violence. The redemptive cult of violence is the primal nature of man. In fact, this is reality. Or so the base and lawless thought. And the base and lawless came to dwell in this naked violence and thrived in its naked glory until it turned on themselves. As Aristotle said, separated from law and justice, man becomes the worst of animals. Thucydides held to very much the same view long before Aristotle. Law and justice is contained in language. Language is used to build law, and justice employs language to render her verdicts. Without moral clarity, without moral character, without an understanding of language, law, justice, and civil society collapse, and we see the cult of violence and its destructive hand as a result of the collapse of language and morality.